This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.
Welcome to Groups, Roles, and Mappings. Oh my! Our agenda for this training is pretty straightforward. We're going to go through OneLogin Groups, then take a look at OneLogin Roles, and finally take a kind of deeper look at what OneLogin calls mappings, which can be used to automatically assign users to OneLogin Groups and or OneLogin Roles. So first, let's take a look at OneLogin Groups. What is a group? In the OneLogin platform, a group is simply a set of users that, as an admin, you can easily assign a user policy to and or assign a specific administrator to. One of the key things to understand about OneLogin Groups is that users can only belong to one group at any given time, unlike groups in other applications where often users can belong to more than one group. So, when might we need to create groups? So what kind of problems can groups solve? Well, one problem you might have is that you need different sets of users to use different authentication factors. For example, you might want your engineers to use YubiKey, but the rest of your users will be using OneLogin Protect. Or maybe you want your security team maybe to reset their passwords every 30 days versus the rest of their company you can have reset their passwords every 60 days. Or say you have an IT admin that is local to your London office and you want them to be able to manage the users in the London office. So let's take a look at how we can solve these problems. For the first scenario, we're going to first create a couple of user policies using different authentication factors. Then we can create a group for each one of these policies. Let's see how this works. All right, so for this particular scenario, we want to make sure that YubiKey as an authentication factor is enabled just for our engineers. So authentication factors are defined within user policies. We have a default user policy, which by default is going to apply to all of our users. And we can see that OneLogin Protect is enabled over here for all of our users as far as an additional authentication factor. But again, we want to create a new user policy, and we will call it the UB policy. And we are going to enable YubiKey as an authentication factor for this particular policy. Now, again, you can manually assign a policy to users, but we are here to discuss groups. So we are going to go create a group for engineers. Just say new group. We can call it engineers and spell engineers correctly. That would be nice. And from the dropdown, choose the UB policy we just created. Click Save. Easy peasy. For the second scenario, where we want the engineers to reset their passwords every 30 days versus the default for everyone else, which is every 60 days, we're going to, again, create a user policy. This time we'll set it so that passwords expire every 30 days. And then we'll create a OneLogin group just for those engineers and associate it with that new policy. So let's check out how we can do that. Second scenario is very much like the first one. We're just creating a new policy, really. In this case, our default policy has everybody resetting their password every 60 days. We want to go in, create a new policy. We'll call it 30-day. And we want them to reset their passwords every 30 days. Everything else we might want to have exactly the same. So in this case, the default was for OneLogin Protect, and we'll have OTP required for OneLogin Protect for this one as well. So again, default going to everybody. This 30-day one is, this case, going to be specific, say, to our security team. So once again, I'm going to go to groups, and I'm going to go create a new group. We'll call it security and associate it with the policy we just created. Ta-da! Easy peasy. For the final scenario, we don't necessarily actually need a new user policy. We just need a new group. So we can create a group associated, say, with an existing user policy. And what we're going to do new this time is assign a group admin to that group. So guess what? Let's check it out. The last scenario actually doesn't involve those user policies. The last scenario is about who gets to administrate a subgroup of users. So for this one, we're just going to go straight to groups, create a new group. We'll call it the London office. And we can or cannot, associate it with the policy. In this case, I just have a default policy anyway. And then click Save. And then we want to make an administrator for this. So in this case, the guy in the London office that we want to make in charge, or everybody who's in the London office, is going to be our friend Brian here. So we're going to go to Brian's user account. We're going to scroll on down and add in a privilege for him. And that privilege, come on up, thank you, is going to be Manage Group. Which group do we want him to manage? The London office. Woohoo! And we will click Continue. It's easy as that. So now Brian has the ability to, modify all the users that belong to the London office group. Now they don't belong yet. That's what we're going to look at yet. But all the users that belong to that London office group, as well as maybe even disable or delete them if necessary. The last thing we need to think about for our groups is how we're going to assign those users to a group. And remember, users can only belong to one group at any given time. Good news is we basically have two options. You can manually assign a user to a group, or you can automatically assign a user to the group. So guess what? Let's go see how we can do that. All right, so we've set up a few different groups, associated them with a user policy and or assign somebody to be a group admin, but we have yet to assign a user to a group. So let's flush out that first scenario where we have the engineers group over here, and the engineers group is assigned to the UB policy. So let's go first, assign a user manually to the engineers group. And we'll torture Mr. Blake Hat for those purposes at the moment. He is part of the engineering department. And we're going to go to the authentication tab over here. And first notice, it's not assigned to a group at this point. And over here, we've got this user security policy drop down, and it's set to default setting is default policy. So he has the default policy assigned to him right now. Now, if I go change his group to engineers and click Save User, then when I go back to the authentication tab, look what's happened. That user security policy dropdown now says his group policy is UB policy, meaning he's now been assigned that UB user policy based upon the fact that he now belongs to the engineers group. Woohoo! Now, let's keep in mind, assigning a whole bunch of groups to a whole bunch of users manually can be a bit tedious, as well as it's just asking for trouble because humans can make mistakes. So, mo better is to go assign automatically. And in OneLogin, we use what are called mappings. Now, mappings are basically if-then statements. They have this conditions section, which is like the if statement, and they have an actions section, which is the then. What am I going to do if these conditions are true? So let's give this a little name, and we're going to call it engineering group mapping, and check the checkbox. And again, the conditions. So these look at user attributes, like what does their company field say? How long has it been since they last logged in? In this case, we want their department to equal, notice we have other options there, but equal in this case, engineering. Might have typed that once or twice. And then if their department equals engineering, we want to change something about them. We can set their role, we can change other attributes, but in this case, we want to set their group to the engineers group. And we're going to click save. Now, mappings fire off automatically every time a user is created or updated. In this case, we just created a mapping. So we have to manually apply the mappings to our users for these changes to take place. And that's what this pop-up is about. Don't forget to reapply all mappings. The mapping won't take effect until you do so. So we're going to click OK. And let's go double check. We're going to go look at a user in the engineering department, Mr. Firewall here. So Mr. Firewall, department does equal engineering, but if we go to his authentication tab, we can see he is not part of any group currently and still has that default user security policy assigned to him. So let's go do what they told us to do, which is click on this button over here, over in the mappings page, and say reapply all mappings. Now this creates a background job that we can monitor under the activity jobs view. Shouldn't take all that long in this case to run. We don't have a whole bunch of users, don't have a whole bunch of mappings. So in fact, we can see it just completed successfully. Woohoo! And it's all done. Depending upon how many users you have, how many mappings you have, this could take quite some time. In this case, it went very, very quickly. So let's go see what it did. In fact, let's go back to Mr. Firewall's record over here. I seem to have a couple for him. I like that name. And let's go to his authentication tab and woohoo! Notice group says engineers and user security policy is now the UB policy. So we have now automatically assigned anybody who's part of the engineering department to that engineers group and thus to the appropriate security policy. There are 3 main factoids y'all need to keep in mind when you're assigning users to groups. If I haven't stated enough, users can only belong to one OneLogin group at a time. Therefore, if you assign a user to a group via a mapping, which is that automatic process we just looked at, you cannot manually assign them to the group because every time you make a change to the user, the mapping's going to fire off and assign them back to whatever group the mapping's assigned them to. You can, however, manually assign them to a user policy. So in the same tab where you could manually assign them to a group if you didn't have a mapping that applied, you can choose a particular user policy for them. Also, if users' attributes match more than one mapping, that is going to assign them to a group. Whichever mapping fires off last, there's an order to those mappings and you can change the order. But whichever one fires off last, i.e. towards the bottom of the list, that one's one that's going to win. So that's going to be the group that that particular user gets assigned to. So keep in mind, only belong to one group at a time. If you have assigned users to mappings and then groups, those mappings always override the manual assignment to a group. And if a user matches more than one mapping's criteria, whichever mapping fires off last, i.e. it gets a number further down in the list, then that is going to determine which group that user belongs to. So just to make sure you understand what this means, let's actually take a look at a couple of those scenarios. So before we move on to roles, let's take a quick look here at a couple of the gotchas. So let's go take a look at Firewall, the guy we just applied the mappings to. And first rule of thumb with groups, users can only belong to one group. Thus, we've got a drop down. You can only select one from the drop down. So the UI enforces that. User can only belong to one group at a time. All right, got that down. Now, let's talk about manual versus automatically assigning a user to a group. This user was automatically assigned to the group because they matched the criteria in the mapping that looked at their department field. Department equals engineering, so they got assigned to the engineers group. If I wanted to, say, manually assign this guy to this other group that I created called sales group and click Save User, it's not going to take, because remember, mappings fire off every time a user is created or updated. I just updated him. If I go to authentication, the mapping fired off again and he's back in the engineers group where he started off. So I cannot manually override what group the user is assigned to if there is a mapping that applies. However, if I wanted to, I could come down here to the user security policy dropdown and manually assign him to a particular user policy. So I can at least override the user policy setting if I want to. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind with these guys. The other thing, and I'm just going to go change this back to group policy assigned based upon user policy, is if a user matches more than one mapping. So currently we have engineering group mapping, department equals engineering. Well, what if I was creating the sales group mapping here and wasn't totally paying attention, and when I defined the condition, I didn't type in sales. I was just chitty-chatting with people and set this up. And so I'll go click Save. So now, technically, I got quite a few users, in fact, here that will match both criteria, and each one is assigning them to a particular group. Well, which one will win? Well, number 2 will win. It's the last that fires off. They fire off in order. 1, 2, if I had more, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's the order that they will go. So the ones further down the list fire off last. Last in wins. Okay. So if I do reapply mappings at this point, let's go make sure the job completes before we go check its effect. Oh, that was less than a minute ago, so that was my little reapply mappings click. Let's go back over to firewall and we will see firewall is no longer in the engineering group, now in the sales group. Oops. So what do I need to do? Well, I should probably test mappings and pay attention to them. This is why having something like the Enterprise Sandbox can be really helpful. So you can kind of test out the effects of these things before you go and apply them to all of your users. So now we say department equals sales, assign them to the sales group. All right, so remember the gotchas, just be careful. Other than that, have fun. So in addition to groups, OneLogin has roles, and roles are used to assign users to one or more applications. So 2 key differences between groups and roles. Group is associated with a user security policy. Thus, group is used to assign a user security policy to users, whereas a role is associated with one or more app connectors. So the roles are used to assign users to one or more applications. So main difference. Groups, user security policies. Roles, user applications. So how you design your roles is up to you. You might base your role design off of your departments or teams. For example, have a role called sales and associate it with those applications that people in the sales department need. Then assign everyone in the sales department to the role. Another approach is to create one role for each application, at least each application that has provisioning enabled. When provisioning is enabled, users will be automatically created within the applications when they are assigned to the application. So if you want to more carefully control when users are assigned to the application in order to control licensing for it, you might want to create a role just for that app, and thus have more control when users are assigned to the app. When a user is removed from the role, their access to the application is automatically removed as well. And with provisioning enabled, this means they are automatically disabled or deleted within the application. or deprovisioned. So creating roles, pretty simple. Let's go take a look. So now we need to create a role. Again, I'm going to go to that users menu, same place I went to go create the groups and the mappings, and I'm going to choose roles. So I've got a default role here, makes my life easy, but I'm going to go create a new role. And in fact, I'm going to create it for Office 365. So again, I can design my roles off of departments, and or I might associate one role, one application, like I have an app connector here to Office 365. Again, up to you. This one role per app really helps, especially when you have something like provisioning enabled, which I do with Office 365. And maybe I want to be careful with my provisioning, my licensing assignment process there. So this just makes it a little bit safer. So I'll click Save. Now I've created a role and I've associated it with an application. Guess what? Assigning users to roles, same options. You can assign them manually, or you can assign them automatically like we did with groups using mappings. Big difference again between groups and mappings at this point is a user can be assigned to more than one role versus, remember with those groups, only one group at a time. So let's take a look at how to go and assign those roles. All right, now we need to assign our user to a role. Again, two options, manual or automatic. So manual, once again, let's go to user record, like Blake had here. And this time go to the application tab. You can see he's actually already been assigned a particular app. FedEx, that was done manually here. Clicking on list of my apps that I have and assigning him. But in this case, we're going to manually assign him to an app via the role we just created. So I'll see a list of all roles that exist in my OneLogin account over on the left-hand side here. Currently, he's not assigned to any of them. Do not be fooled. Just because they are listed does not mean he is assigned. It just lists out all the roles over there. To assign him manually, I click on the role. Now I have a pretty green check mark. And I'm going to click Save User. So now he has manually been assigned to the Office 365 role. And if I go back over here, I will see Office 365. Now it failed with my provisioning because that's not fully configured in this case, but he has been assigned to the application. So that is manual assignment. Now, if I want to automatically assign users to that Office 365 role, then I go to those mappings again. So in this case, maybe I want all my users, say, to be assigned to Office 365. And when I configure Office 365, I'm typically configuring it for a particular email domain. We federate those Azure AD domains to make the connection. So we want the email to contain the name of the domain that we federated over in Office 365. So in this case, it's actually OneLoginTrainMe.com. So if their email contains OneLoginTrainMe.com, meaning they should have one of those Office 365 accounts to access that email, I want to set their role to that Office 365 role. And I'm going to click Save. And once again, I forgot to put a name in it, so let's put the name. Office 365 mapping. There we go. And now we'll save it. And again, does this mean everybody's now been assigned Office 365? No, because mappings only fire off when users are created or updated. I have simply created a mapping over here. So I need to manually apply it to my users by clicking on that Reapply All Mappings. So now it's going to run through all these mappings, find all users that have OneLoginTrainMe.com in their email address, and assign them to the Office 365 role. So let's go look at our users. And we can see Blake Hat got manually assigned to it, but here we have, for example, Firewall. Firewall is at OneLoginTrainMe.com. Therefore, he was assigned to the Office 365 role. Now, again, remember the provisioning not fully configured, so it'll probably show that it's failed. But if I go over here, well, it's pending actually, I can see he got assigned to the Office 365 role. Now, it looks a little different. So remember when Blake Hat got manually assigned to the role, he had the green check mark. But when a user is automatically assigned via a mapping, we get these kind of double arrows. If you hover over it, it tells you can't change this because it was assigned via a mapping, can't be removed manually, kind of thing. So we know what happened. We know that they got assigned to the role automatically via a mapping. So by now, we've mentioned those mappings a few times. Right now, let's just take a little bit more in-depth look at how to use those mappings. Again, mappings enable you to automatically change user attributes and assign them to roles and groups based on particular conditions you've defined. So you can use mappings to grant application access, of course, to a user based upon some sort of attributes, maybe even looking at their member of field, which if they're coming from Active Directory, would be like the Windows groups that they belong to in Active Directory. And if they match, like the string of member of has the word engineering in it, if a user matches that criteria, then we can apply some sort of action to them. And that action could be to update other user attributes, assign them to a role, and or assign them to a group. So let's take a look at a couple more mapping examples than what we've seen so far. All right, so we've already used mappings to assign users to a role and to assign a user to a group. So one other way to use mappings can also be to modify other user attributes. Basically, a role that they belong to, a group that they belong to is an attribute. But mappings can control other settings as well. So just for the fun of it, let's play with modifying, say, the country or the company that they're in. So maybe my OneLogin account actually has two companies. And in fact, if you look at my users, let's really quickly go do that. If you look at my users, you can see I've got at least two different email addresses set up here. Some people have OneLoginTraining.com and some people have OneLoginTrainMe. Okay. We also have demo. So in fact, we could say that we've got at least three different companies, but just for the sake of it, let's play with demo and OneLoginTrainMe. So what can we do here? Well, what if we wanted to update their company field based upon what's in their email address? We can do that with a mapping. So let's do this just for OneLoginTraining. Oops, train me. OneLogin Train Me. And so we'll create a similar rule that we did actually for that Office 365 one. Email contains OneLoginTrainMe.com. And the action, in this case, not set role or group, let's go down here and we can actually set company to OneLogin Train Me and click save. Okay, so I could have done this a couple of ways. I could have just modified that Office 365 mapping. I chose to create a new mapping. Kind of up to me how I want to organize those things, but let's do that. Reapply all mappings again. And let's go make sure it completed. So not fun to go look at the demo and it's not done. And let's go back over to our users and let's go find one of our OneLogin Train Me users like Firewall here. And notice company is now filled in with OneLogin Train Me. So again, our mappings can be used to set or change most attributes of a user within OneLogin. And that would include then role that they belong to, group that they belong to, or simply changing one of their other user attributes or user fields that we are storing within OneLogin. So, in conclusion, a few points. Just want to make sure we understand here. Groups, for the most part, are used to assign users to user policies, those security policies that control how a user logs into the OneLogin portal, basically. Roles are used to, again, for the most part, assign users to applications. Which app connector tiles are they going to see in their OneLogin portal? And finally, mappings, for the most part, are used to assign users automatically to one or more roles and or to a group based upon user attributes matching the criteria defined within the mappings. Thank you for attending our Groups, Roles, Mappings, Oh My training.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.